Nobody warns you that the quietest moment of your marriage can split your whole life into before and after. I found out everything, and I mean everything, by accident, on a Tuesday that smelled like burnt sage and old rain. And what I discovered was not what I had been afraid of finding. My name is Zuri Adaize Okonkwo Barrero, and I want to be very clear before I tell you what happened next. I was not a suspicious wife. I was not the kind of woman who checks phones in the dark or holds her breath when her husband leaves a room. I was the kind of woman who left her own phone unlocked, who shared her email password with her mother, who believed transparency was a love language nobody had officially named yet. I was open the way high windows are open, letting everything in, offering the same to the sky. I had built my entire identity around trust, the way some people build around ambition or faith. It was not naive. It was intentional. I had decided, early, that I would not live inside suspicion. I had watched women I loved fold themselves around surveillance and become smaller for it, calibrating their happiness to the angle of someone else's phone screen, and I had decided I was not going to do that. Not because I was certain Adira was perfect, but because I understood, at some bone-deep level, that suspicion changes you more than it protects you. It rewires the architecture of how you see. It makes you fluent in absence rather than presence. I did not want that fluency. And yet, that Tuesday, Adairo, my husband of 4 years, the man I met at a ceramics class where he dropped the bowl and blamed the clay with the kind of straight-faced sincerity that made the whole room laugh, left his phone on the kitchen counter while he ran to the pharmacy. It buzzed 3 times. That is normal. I did not look. I started washing the kombucha glasses we'd used that morning, and then his phone buzzed the 4th time and the screen lit up at an angle that showed me a preview I couldn't unsee. A voice note notification from someone saved only as Kess. He had never mentioned anyone named Kess. I want to say something sat in my chest like a cold stone. But the truth is stranger than that. Nothing sat anywhere at first. There was a half-second of absolute stillness, like when lightning comes before the sound, and your body already knows something has ripped through the air above you, but hasn't decided how to name it yet. That half-second felt like holding a word in your mouth that you've read many times but never heard spoken aloud. You hold the shape of the word against your tongue and wait. Then Adairo came back. He grabbed his phone without looking at me, said the pharmacy was out of the magnesium he wanted, and disappeared into his studio. He records ambient music for sync licensing, layers field recordings over synthesizer work, which means our apartment regularly fills with sounds that are technically music but feel more like weather. Rain over slow arpeggios, birdsong stretched until it becomes something geometrical. He has a gift for making the ordinary sound ancient. This is relevant, and I'll tell you why in a moment. I stood at the sink for 6 minutes. I counted them on the oven clock because I needed something to anchor me to the physical world. Then I dried my hands on the dish towel, the one with the pattern of small crabs that I bought at a market in Porto 2 years ago, and cannot explain why I love so much. Then I walked to his studio door and knocked, and asked if I could record a voice memo on his phone because mine was dead. He said sure, and handed it through the gap without fully opening the door, his arm extended like a periscope into the hallway, trusting me absolutely with everything he owned. He gave me his phone. I'm not going to pretend I felt guilty. I'm not going to construct a version of myself that paused at the ethical threshold and weighed consequences. I pressed play on the voice note from Kess. It was not what I expected. I want to say it was worse, but I also don't know if that's the right word anymore. Different. It was different in a way that required a new vocabulary I had to invent on the spot, in the hallway, alone, with the faint sound of synthesizers seeping under the studio door. The voice was low and male and unbothered. The voice of someone who doesn't perform even in private, which is a specific and rare quality. Kess said, "Bro, I'm not trying to overstep, but you've been seeming different since the thing with Zuri. Like not bad different. Like you're holding something. Is she as sharp as you said? Because what you told me at Oleander, man, I don't know what to do with that. I keep thinking about it." I almost didn't press play on Adairo's reply. Almost. There was a moment where I held the phone and thought about the kind of person I wanted to be in the next 30 seconds. And then I pressed play. He said, and I will reconstruct this as accurately as my memory allows, because I have played it in my mind approximately 900 times since. "She's sharper than I deserve, Kess. That's the problem. You know when you marry someone, and then you watch them figure out who they actually are, and you realize you were just a phase of their becoming? I'm a season, man. I'm not the whole story. She's going to outgrow me completely, and the part that scares me is I think she already has. She just hasn't noticed yet because she's too generous to notice. That woman has been covering for me with her grace for so long, I think she's forgotten she's doing it. When she wakes up, fully wakes up, I don't know what she'll do with me. I stood in the hallway for a very long time. There's a creek that runs behind the neighborhood where I grew up, in the kind of city that doesn't get called a city in magazine features, but has a downtown with one jazz bar and 3 competing barbershops, and a library that stays open late on Thursdays because someone on the board fought for it 20 years ago, and no one has undone it since. The creek made a sound in spring thaw that my grandmother called the water finding itself. She said every river has a moment each year when it remembers where it's going. She would take me there in the mud season cold, and we'd stand at the bank and listen, and she'd say, "You hear that? That is not a beginning or an ending. That is a middle that knows what it is." I heard that sound in my own chest in that hallway, and I did not know whether to be devastated or electrified, and both feelings kept arriving at the same time and refusing to yield to each other. Here's what I had been expecting, in the most private chamber of my worry. Infidelity, or something clean and terrible like that. Something with a name and a shape and a defined category of response. A betrayal I could hold in 2 hands and look at directly. Something that came with a script, even a brutal one. What I had found instead was my husband, this man who still cuts the crusts off his toast and is embarrassed when you notice, who names every plant we've ever bought and mourns them audibly when they die, who fell asleep on our second date in the middle of a film neither of us was watching and apologized for it for approximately 6 months. What I had found was this man quietly, honestly, and in a private voice note to his best friend, articulating his own inadequacy with a precision I had never heard him apply to anything. He wasn't hiding a secret from me. He was hiding a truth about me, and those are not the same thing at all. I put the phone on the kitchen counter. I went to our bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at my hands and thought, he is both completely right and completely wrong. He has correctly identified the phenomenon and incorrectly diagnosed the cause, and there is something almost unbearable about that, about being known and misread at the same time, by the person you have chosen to be known by. He had assembled a true set of observations and arrived at a false conclusion, the way you can hold every correct ingredient and still produce the wrong meal. Right, because yes, I had been covering. Covering is perhaps the wrong word. Accommodating, maybe. Building around him like a vine that adjusts its direction to avoid crowding the host plant, which can look identical to thriving if you're not looking closely. We had moved twice for his sessions. I had turned down a residency in Ghent because we couldn't afford 2 places, and he was in the middle of a project that mattered to him. I had told myself this was partnership. But the thing about quietly chosen sacrifices is that they accumulate in a way that quietly chosen joys never quite match. You can wake up one day and discover that freedom of choice is not the same as freedom of self, and the gap between those 2 things has been quietly widening for years while you were busy being generous. He was right that I had been doing this. He was right that I was generous to a fault I had never examined. He was wrong because he had concluded from all of this that he was a season, temporary scaffolding, and that the only story possible was the one where I woke up and discovered I'd already left in every way that mattered, before I'd physically gone. He had taken my accommodation and read it as evidence of my eventual departure, which is the most painful possible misreading, because he couldn't see that what actually needed addressing was the accommodation itself, not its fictional conclusion. I sat with this for a very long time. Outside, it started raining the particular way it rains in autumn, when the year is trying to close itself. Not violently, just steadily, with great patience, the way rain falls when it has somewhere specific to be. I need to tell you about the time Adairo sat with me in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning, not because anything catastrophic had happened, but because I'd had a panic attack so severe I'd lost peripheral vision for 20 minutes. He sat beside me in a plastic chair under fluorescent light for 4 hours without once looking at his phone, without once making himself the protagonist of the story. He brought me a cup of terrible vending machine tea and held it while I drank because my hands were shaking. He said almost nothing because he understood that what I needed was not words, but presence, the specific and irreplaceable fact of someone choosing to remain. He didn't narrate this afterward. When I tried to bring it up later, he changed the subject the way he changes the subject when he's embarrassed by his own goodness, like a person who holds a door and doesn't want to be thanked because it seems to them like the only reasonable thing to do. He is not temporary scaffolding. He is a man who has confused my becoming for his erasure, a specific kind of fear that is not unreasonable but is wrong. And I bear some responsibility in that confusion, because I had not been telling him what I needed. An absence of complaint is not the same as contentment, and I had let him confuse those two things long enough that they had calcified into something he couldn't see past anymore. I didn't confront him that night. I made oxtail stew, which takes hours and requires patience, and smells like something your body recognizes before your memory does. And I let him emerge from his studio when the smell drew him out, which it always does. We ate at the table with his music on, one of the ambient pieces he'd finished the week before. It sounded like fog deciding to become water. I watched him eat and said nothing, because some conversations need to be entered from a rested place, and I was not yet rested. Here is the moment that changed everything more than the voice note did. 3 days later, I sat across from Adaro in the morning light, the kind that comes through our east window in October and lands crooked across the table like it can't quite commit to a direction, and I told him I wanted to talk. He put down his coffee. His face went to that careful place it goes when he's preparing to hold something heavy. I said, "I want to know what you tell Kes about me." The silence was substantial. It had weight and texture. He was still, then very still. He looked at me in a way I cannot fully describe, a way that contained both being caught and being found, which are not the same experience, but can happen simultaneously in a face that is fundamentally honest. He didn't ask how I knew about Kes. He didn't ask if I'd listened. He looked at me for a long moment and said, very quietly, "Probably the truth." I said, "Tell me again," to my face. He took a breath from somewhere lower than his lungs and said, "You are the most entire person I have ever known. I don't know what to do with someone who is that entire. I grew up around people who were always incomplete, always apologizing for the gap between who they were and who they meant to be. You don't do that. You are just, fully, here. And I love you so much, and I am also terrified of you, in the way you're terrified of things you don't want to lose. Sometimes I watch you choose to stay inside the boundaries of our life, and I can't tell if that's love or sacrifice, and the not knowing keeps me up at night. I'm afraid that one day you'll calculate the cost of all your accommodations and look at me and see a debt you never agreed to hold." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "It's love," I said, "but I've been expressing it in a language you can't fully read. I've been accommodating you and calling it love, and not telling you when I needed different things. That's on me. We can fix that. I'm not a plant in a pot, Adiro. I'm not going to overgrow the container and leave. I'm going to tell you when I need a bigger container, and we're going to build one together." He put his other hand over mine. We sat like that for a while, in the crooked morning light, and I thought, the water is finding itself. It is loud and cold, and it is moving where it was always going to move. The change that followed was not dramatic. Life does not reorganize itself in response to a single honest conversation. The conversation opens a door. What comes next is the slow work of walking through it. What happened was that I stopped accommodating in ways I hadn't named as accommodation. I started the sound documentary I'd been conceptualizing for 2 years, about women who work in traditionally silent industries, data centers, noise-controlled manufacturing, anechoic labs, and I told Adiro about it not as a proposal awaiting approval, but as a statement of intention delivered with room for conversation, and without the preemptive apology I'd been inserting into everything I wanted for myself. He said, "Can I score it? I'd been waiting for you to do something I could score." I laughed the way you laugh when something lands exactly right in a place you didn't know was empty. What happened was that I called my mother more, not to perform wellness, but to actually talk. My mother, whose name is Ifunanya, which means love is supreme, said, "Baby, love doesn't subtract you. If it's subtracting you, tell the man. Men can't read the subtraction if you're still smiling." What happened was that Adero started leaving the studio door open when he worked. Small thing, enormous thing. What happened was that I discovered, through a mutual friend, that Kes was a music therapist who specialized in working with couples navigating gradual distance. Not explosive rupture, but the slow drift that happens when two people are loving each other and also quietly failing to be fully honest. Adero hadn't been confessing to a friend. He had been, in his oblique way, reaching toward help without knowing how to ask for it directly. I did not tell him I knew. Some things are better held than spoken. We began sessions with a therapist named Macoa Vieira, who has a quality of stillness that communicates she has nowhere else to be and has chosen this room, these two people, fully and without remainder. She asked us in the first session to describe the other's love language without using the official terminology. Adairo described mine as, she creates conditions. I described his as, he witnesses. Macoa wrote something down and did not show us what it said. I sometimes think about what she wrote. I have decided it is something simple and true. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from being witnessed by someone whose job is not to take sides, but to hold the space steady. Someone who has no investment in the outcome, and therefore no reason to distort what they see. Macoa Vieira did that for us over 14 months. She watched us learn to say the quiet things out loud, and she watched us become less afraid of what the other person would do with the truth. And at the end, she told us she thought we were ready to do it without her. She was right. The rooms on the other side of that door were ordinary and difficult and entirely ours. And we had learned, finally, how to be in them together without anyone performing a version of themselves they could not sustain. In February, I traveled to Reykjavik for 3 weeks. I stood in an anechoic chamber at a research facility on a Tuesday, Tuesdays again, doing their quiet work, and experienced the kind of silence that is not absence but density, silence you can feel against your eardrums like pressure. I thought about Adairo layering sounds in his studio, and understood something I hadn't before. He hears in layers. He always has. What I thought was emotional distance was actually a form of attention, the attention of someone who listens beneath the surface of what's said. He had been paying attention to me in layers the entire time, and I had been reading it as withdrawal. These are entirely different things, and I had confused them for years. I called him from outside the facility, in the Icelandic cold, my breath making small clouds that dissolved almost immediately. I said, "I think I understand your music better now." He said, "I think I wrote half of it for you." I said, "I know." The documentary premiered 8 months later at a small festival that is not famous, but is respected in the specific circles where respect is earned slowly and lost almost never. Adairo scored it with restraint and precision, with sounds that came up under the women's voices like something surfacing, patient and inevitable, the way a tide arrives without urgency and changes everything it touches. Afterward, Serafine Uchida Boateng, who makes audio work about labor and invisibility, came up to me and said, "The score, that's your husband's work?" I said yes. She said, "He knows you very well." I said, "We're figuring it out." She laughed like she knew exactly what that meant. Here is what I want to leave with you. You can love someone completely and still be slowly invisible to yourself inside that love. This is not a small problem. It is also not necessarily a reason to leave. It is a reason to speak, which is not arguing, not issuing demands, not performing honesty so loudly that it functions as accusation. Speaking, in this context, means saying the quiet thing out loud. It means telling your partner, "I have been making myself smaller and calling it love, and I need to unlearn that, and I need you to see me doing it." It means giving the other person the dignity of knowing what's actually happening inside you, instead of letting them guess and guess wrong and build an entire architecture of fear on the wrong foundation. Adairo told me 6 months later over the oxtail stew I now make with better technique and slightly different spices, that when he realized I'd heard the voice note, his first feeling was not anger or shame, but something closer to relief. A window opening in a room that had been closed too long. He said, "I'd wanted to say those things to you for 2 years and I didn't know how. Kes was easier because the stakes felt lower. Kes doesn't love me the way you do, so I wasn't afraid of what he'd do with the information." I said, "That's not how it should work." He said, "No, but it's how it worked." And we fixed it. The creek still runs behind my grandmother's house, even though she's been gone 3 years. Water doesn't grieve the way people do. It adjusts, pools in new places, carves new channels through rock so gradually you wouldn't witness it in a lifetime of watching, but would return in 100 years and find the whole landscape changed. My grandmother said the creek would outlast everything we built in that neighborhood, and she wasn't wrong, and she wasn't sad about it. She thought persistence was its own kind of comfort. I am Zuri Adeze Okonkwo Barrero. I found a voice note by accident. I pressed play. What I heard was not a betrayal. It was a mirror, slightly warped, held by someone who loved me but didn't yet know how to say it to my face. And instead of putting the mirror down, I asked him to hold it steady while we both looked. That was the whole of it. That was everything. If any part of this felt true to you, save it, like it, and subscribe. The stories that change us deserve to be heard.